Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this episode of the Intelligence Spotlight series. After a while, we've been researching to find the very best in the field, and we found Ben. Ben Heubl is an investigative journalist at Süddeutsche Zeitung, where he focuses on open source intelligence, or commonly known as OSINT, to uncover stories about global security, human rights, and environmental issues. Before joining Süddeutsche Zeitung, he started working in the UK, writing for big names like the Economist and the Financial Times. Since 2022, he's been part of the Süddeutsche Zeitung investigative team, diving deep into data, journalism, and OSINT techniques to tell stories that really matter. Welcome to this episode of Intelligence Spotlight series, Ben.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Great. Ben, I might have a very quirky question in the beginning. How many people do you know that have your name working in the same field?
Surprisingly, there's a lot of Bens. I have to say, there's many Bens in the OSINT field, but I think there's a lot of Bens and Benedicts, and it's sort of a very weird common name in that field. I have lots of colleagues. Maybe I don't want to mention it, but there's a few Bens out there, yeah.
Absolutely. And I guess that also comes from that experience of interacting with a lot of Bens that I had in the OSINT field. So it was quite interesting. And I call them by Dutch Ben, Aussie Ben, German Ben. So that's how we could differentiate the Bens in the field. So, OSINT has become a very powerful tool for journalists, especially. And investigators use OSINT for different purposes. And it's fascinating how it can uncover hidden stories and can make sense of the chaos in today's world. But everyone's journey into OSINT is unique, and there is a starting point into it, like where it starts, how they get into this field. So what does OSINT actually mean to you personally? And when was the first time that you actually started working in this field? Was it there like a particular moment or experience that really shaped your path and that you decided to get into it?
I would like to tell you that there was this big epiphany for me, but I think many of the older folks who sort of research on the internet now and previously researched in archives and all other places, they found this acronym OSINT somewhere on Twitter. I thought, okay, well, I'm actually already doing this kind of stuff anyway. And for me, it was a sort of data journalist. I looked for new data in all kinds of corners and archives and all kinds of like areas. For me, it became more important to focus on the data point instead of the big statistical analysis of things, to find investigative stories or news stories. I was always looking for new data sources. And then suddenly there was this hashtag OSINT on Twitter back then I think it was 2016, 17, 2018, probably rather later. And I was like, okay, so I have to check this out. And then I felt rather stupid when I found out that it was actually a big new thing and what the intelligence community is already doing. I wasn't so aware of all this stuff, but I was aware that I want to use it, and I want to use it for investigative reporting and for analysis. And the second question part was how I got to this. And remind me, what was the second question?
Yeah, I mean, how you got to it. Was there a particular moment for you that you started in this field? Was it after that you found out the term existed, or before that you were doing it, but you found the term later?
Yeah, so I think I got really interested in sort of researching myself, understanding where I'm sort of vulnerable, and in terms of back then at DFT, I did lots of Southeast Asia stories, but also particularly China stories. I was sort of aware that there is, a level of transparency as a journalist. You present yourself on the web, and I wanted just to know how secure I am. So I researched myself, and that there's different data points, your street address, all the breadcrumbs you leave as a journalist, going to conferences, for example, and stuff. And so that sort of was one intro to understand, okay, so I can actually apply this to others. And then sort of the 2-3 years later, around 2019, 2020, I got really interested in finding sources So for me, it was important to use knowledge and these OSINT tools to get in touch to the people I want to really talk to. And I found it interesting because etiquette really quite changed to approach people. In the old days, you went in. My colleague uses he's a sort of long-time investigative journalist for a long time in this space, and he tells his students that in the old days you walked into a bar and you had basically a fitness bag with your big fitness, like a duffel bag and a few coins in your trousers, and sort of ask the students, what are you going to do with that? And the big duffel bag is for, putting in documents, and coins are for, copying basically in a shop. So that's the old story. And the new story is, okay, so you need to go online and need to approach your Russian sources or your Ukrainian sources or your troops, wherever they might be, intel sources, that they tell you something they wouldn't tell anybody else. And in order for that to appear legitimate, and you need to obviously approach them and not only write them the 2 lines saying, work for this and this organization, please help me, but you need to also know a little bit about the person, and for that you also use OSINT. So it's a way of building trust in the ether, and that is not easy. This is something everybody still struggles. And for journalists, we sell our knowledge and stories on the basis of that the other person sees the benefit, because we can't pay them. We don't pay for sources. They need to understand that we are legit and we're serious what we do, and for that we need to know a little bit more about them as well.
That's quite a story, I would say. So your work at Süddeutsche Zeitung has been really impressive. I've been following some of the news and I've heard your name a couple of times, especially your recent piece about the attack in the US, titled 300 Meter Todesfahrt. The level of detail was really interesting, how it was visualized, how long the person drove there, and it must have taken a lot of work to put all that together, I guess. So how long have you been with the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and what was your approach or methodology to investigate this particular incident?
So I joined Süddeutsche in 2, and before that I was at a small magazine, and before that I was working in the UK for large newspapers. Süddeutsche is good to me because it's a very open environment for how to tell stories online. We got this approach of storytelling. It's a space at a certain CMS where you can build into the CMS videos and maps and every sort of stuff you can possibly think of, what you can do with CSS and JavaScript and iframes. You can really scrolly tell your way through a visual investigation. These stories actually are not that much work, because if you have an incident and you do a reconstruction on it, there's so much people already out there that do this really well, and all you really need to do to get those figures right and those is the timeline, and you gotta just be good in verifying what other people already tried to put on the table. And so I think the difficult part is to what to take in and what not to. And for that, you got to be quick, but also you got to be talking to people on the ground. I think there's few investigations where you really just live off material. So the best investigations in those, what is it now, 2.5 years, is really those where we had people on the ground, foreign correspondents on conflict zones, and sort of finding one shrapnel and then be able to verify it from the number of the shrapnel to the death of kids in a kindergarten. I think one was in Eritrea. That was sort of high. That was a peak of acceleration. So it does need people to reconfirm, and that's what people in the intelligence community always say, right? You need handlers and you need agents and you need analysts who's basically desk people, and only that interplay is really paying off. We had another case before I joined here at a Swiss public radio and TV, and we did an investigation together with actually folks from Lighthouse Reports on it was called Swiss Arms Transfers, and there was a certain type of plane, Pilatus plane, I don't know if you were, they were sort of to the US and then exported from there, sort of refitted and then used as a reconnaissance plane. But the point was that in that difficult time, it was on Afghanistan. We had people basically in the field, a photographer who managed to get into one of the hidden hangars and took photos, and then we had all the intel, and we told them where to go and where to search. And we confirm this stuff is really exciting. And recently we had an investigation where we sort of tracked the spy fleet of Russia, sort of, if you will, research vessels that being reapplied for certain purposes. And for that, we had one ship entering with, there are more signals, sort of weather reports entering the coast of generally Denmark and sort of that area. And we calculated how fast their colleagues from the Northern NDR broadcaster had to be to make it exactly in time that research vessel passes a certain strait, and so they can fly their drones. And it worked out perfectly. They just got the very tip of Denmark when that ship was like speeding by with 10 knots. So this is the kind of really exciting stuff, and we were like really excited to like calculate stuff. But it just comes back to very normal analyst intelligence work, would probably any analyst. But it's like, for journalists, we are more than not live in the scene and in that moment of something happens. How do we get the best details? So while other agencies or organizations might have like a few months to investigate, and we don't actually have that much time on each case. When it like that case in the US, it went really fast. But then we have also a lot of people looking at it, not inside here, but also like below us. So I would say the key to success is to build up that sort of little black book of fellow investigators and establish yourself as a legitimate source for, as a tradesman. You obviously have to give them their recognition. If somebody gives you some intel, you wouldn't just use it without naming the source or their efforts. If somebody else finds it, then you cannot just say it's yours, you found it. So this is it's a lot of things that a lot of OSINT people really get hung up.
Those are a lot of elements into ethics of it and the originality of it. And there I've seen cases where one OSINT finds something and the other one actually refutes that finding, saying, okay, because I looked at it from this angle. And it's quite good, but both try to find the truth. So you always have a different angle to it. There's contextual angle to it as well. From which context do you see an incident in different regions of the world as well? And especially with the research vessels, I think there were a lot of misinformation going on around the Russian research fleet that, okay, they may have been behind the bombing of the pipeline and the Baltic Sea or things like that. So I think it's also with the digital tools and social media, all of that, especially on X and other platforms, we see a rise in misinformation as well. And I feel like journalists are constantly racing to verify these facts, especially if it's affecting geopolitics. And I think OSINT plays a very important and critical part into this field, especially in journalism. So in this time and age, how important do you think OSINT is for journalists generally?
So we're teaching this kind of stuff as well to newbies and stuff. And we have a lot of people coming through our door to work here for a few months. I think what's really important to see is that there's generally a huge interest. There's a huge buzz around it. What I can say is that very, very useful OSINT is for three things. One is to confirm sort of a culprit, take the typical story of a local or national, somebody shoots somebody else or causes drama and problems in an area, then it's good to verify the identity. And I still think that the person investigation is sort of the key part to success here. It's also one of the most difficult parts, but it's something that I think is most sort of OSINT. The second part is finding the sources. We talked about it briefly. Finding the person who wants to talk, a family member of a culprit, or perhaps a previous teacher of a politician who is sort of in a difficult situation, who published a pamphlet around right-wing national ideas or whatever. This is the kind of stuff you need to chase. So the right sources who tell you or confirm, and then we usually say it's like 2 or 3 sources we need to confirm something. That's sort of the old rule that I learned previous colleagues at The Economist. One says like you need 3 sources confirming something, and then you have a story there. And the third is a place and time event verification. That's something that everything around an event is sort of interesting, and for that you need to filter what is really causing something and what isn't. So these are the 3 things I find it most useful for. And yeah, I think, I mean, with the caveat that you don't use OSINT to tell stories by itself, I think you have to have somebody on the ground or have some more additional information. I've did a whole session on leak verification, and I know that other people like fall on it as well on this track. It's we found a lot of data in new, bigger and smaller leaks, and how do you be sure that this stuff is real? So somebody might not trick you, but you need to still verify each detail, and for that verification bit is interesting. For me personally, I don't see, for my work, I don't see the verification is everything OSINT has to deliver. I mean, we do fact checks for other pieces, and it's nice to triangulate and see, can something be true and can something not be true? That's really cool. The real bolts of an investigation is not purely relying on the evidence you struck together in different pieces. Although, I mean, I have to say, OSINT can be really good in building networks and in collecting, how you collect each detail about a person, about a group, and then from there you can follow on and ask further questions. So it's always just going back and forth. I mean, I have to say, person investigations are interesting bits in part, and a lot of the OSINT details sort of non-biometric or non-interchangeable. So somebody has an email address and has the next day a different email address, and so you gotta be going around and finding how a person lives with this detail. This is online stuff, right? And so for us, it's like sort of like going back always to authorities or public information or like confirmed biometric information, for example, a name or the identity of a person, which somebody cannot just simply change, And then OSINT is also, OSINT is sort of a void of unknown information. I mean, as I said, like this Morse data, I mean, I would say it's also it's a SIGINT effort to collect those details. It still counts as novel details in something that is somewhat semi-open or open. I have to say, like, from my experience, how professionals work, I mean, sort of been in the space for a little bit now, and here, even seeing what the pros do, I can say that not always the stuff is super open. It's sometimes paid. It's sometimes from leaked data. It's sometimes from darknet forums. It's all, it's not so easy that you switch on a machine and everything other people would know. As I said, you search for signals, and if you go in a certain direction and you have 3 or 4 or 5 signals saying the same thing, then you can, as a journalist, pitch something. Whether then you tell the whole story with those, and it's the other thing. Rarely you do, I'd say, but definitely have a hook, and you definitely get like an inch further to already know what's out there. I mean, if I know, for example, a company is shady, the first thing I would do is like look at their employees' details. They would probably share some or share some light that something is at odds. If there's deeply rooted problem inside of the organization, you will find out about it, or you go on like any of sort of review sites, or you get a sense of it. You cannot write in your piece, on Komuno or on Glassdoor, somebody said this and that. That's not going to work, but you get like a first inch into an investigation. So I think it's for a pre-investigation into a subject, or if you're sort of a news journalist, so checking something initially, then OSINT is a really good way forward.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned a couple of different techniques while you were talking about, like, because in one way, if something is shady, you don't go directly to it. You go around it to see what else there is, how it is connected, to whom it is connected. And I think it leads us to this very important part of our discussion, and that's about principles. As a journalist, as an OSINTer who is conducting an investigation. So for you, what are your main principles when you busy doing an investigation, no matter the project? And has there been any difficulties in dealing with some projects that had somehow did not align with your principles?
No, because then we wouldn't have done it, I think. And like it's a job. It's I do it like I'm not. I mean, in terms of principle, there is obviously ethics. I would say we can do, other people can't do, and there are certain things that we wouldn't do, other people can do. So we never hack anybody. We never impose, sort of credentials in anything. This is something we wouldn't do, and we never did. The other thing is sort of like, I do think that certain data can be exploited in a different way. So we got to be careful here. If we have like certain, we have to really protect our sources. That means like if we do so search with those credentials, like for example, a name and an email address, we have to make sure that nobody gets to it. So we need to apply certain search techniques. We had one investigation where we had to be extremely careful of how we search and what we search, because every hit on their website would have alerted them, from a different country and so on. So we applied secure services like Tails, for example, or there's a few that sort of like virtual machines that run on a safe basis. But then, you got to be honest, like, what's the trade-off for that? It was extremely painful to search and do any OSINT on those systems because security had to be priority number one. So what's the trade-off of how much you want to do and how much you can be secure in doing your work? So, and that's pretty much it. I think one is for us the source protection.
Right.
Number two is like protecting ourselves, or I would say like that's equal. The other thing is, I mean, I guess when I talked about like contacting sources, you obviously have to contact like very sensible sources that live through very horrible and sort of bad time.
Yeah.
Think of Gaza, think of Darfur, think of Sudan, Darfur, think of Eritrea, think of any sort of conflict. If you contact somebody and that person is taking their internet connection that they usually use for their family, and they have little anyway, little data, then they use it for you, then you be sure that you use something from it and use it in a way that they're being helped, or they expose a situation that have to be remedied. So that's something, if that then is not getting into pieces or into articles, there's a feel of guilt of like not being able to help. But after all, then we are like a journalistic organization who is for profit, so we need to write pieces that we can also want to read, and they mean something politically or economically. So yeah, this is sometimes, you obviously want to write every piece that you do, but like sometimes things don't make it into pieces, and then you like, yeah, that's sort of.
Yeah, basically.
Maybe to add to this, often things don't make it into. So the also an investigation that, for example, a Bellingcat would do is much more detailed in the writing, and you may not. We don't use this stuff. I mean, we create in the background all these investigation chains, from getting from one player to the next to a third to like exposing everything. Where we wouldn't put it in pieces if it doesn't fit to the story, and rarely it does. I mean, yeah, rarely it does. Maybe it's just one or two sentences, but these are the very important links that prove something. Then.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And I think what you meant was the principle of do no harm when it comes to your sources, when it comes to yourself, and overall those who are connected to the story. And as the last question, where do you see the OSINT community in Germany, how it is developed compared to the UK? Because in the UK, it's quite a strong community out there. But I wasn't able to find like that kind of a big community, but I'm sure there are, and whether you are connected with them. And lastly, what's your favorite OSINT tool when you use and you love it the most?
Okay, so there is a community in Germany. I don't want to name drop here because the people have enough clout to introduce themselves, but there is a German OSINT community. They have an annual conference. One of the key people there, Matthias Wilson and Samuel Lolaga. So they're really doing a lot on that subject, and they try to get people together and sort of have people speak. And doing also a podcast now. There is something that is developing, and some of the key organizations that people use around the world is Maltego. I think the Maltego crew is actually headquartered in Munich.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have it. I mean, yeah, there is some sort of like technology and cloud and people. Maybe it's often not so hugely transparent and well sold than in the UK or perhaps also in the US. You got to remember also that Germany is very GDPR and data privacy conscious. So for that, it's not something like, you're necessarily proud on to expose somebody. So that's really sometimes maybe a more of a marketing reason. But we do see that our intelligence services hire for these kind of roles. There's more and more big cybersecurity companies that are really keen to investigate with OSINT. But yeah, due to the fact that there's fewer probably public information on a single person, harder to investigate, for example, than in the UK. I'd say if I could choose and pick right now, I'm really curious to see what these people do from OSINT Industries. They really have sort of understood what people need for quick and dirty or shiny investigations. That is really something, as you look for a phone number, you look for an email address, or you look for a username. That's sort of like the key starting points for any investigation. And to get there, it's something they can cover. And EPOS is also something they use frequently. So this is the kind of stuff I would say GeoSend is sort of, Google Earth Pro. That's something I use all the time. I'm super fan that they Google Earth Pro right now on the desktop as well as on your browsers. This is really cool. This is really just getting us really far in fast investigations. Other tools I don't want to name because it's just like it's too diverse, and for each part you can have a different thing. But these are the most important ones here.
Great. Ben, thank you so much for your time. And it was very great talking to you. Very insightful conversation.